Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this office hour. It's July 2nd, 2025, and we are going to record this session for the benefit of those people who can't make this session. They might be interested in the conversation and the answers to the questions that stakeholders have about the two topics that we've decided to cover in this office hour are first, the social cost of carbon quickly, because we think there's just one or two questions about that. If Carol Lynch is here, we'll start with her. And then if there are other questions from stakeholders on the call, we'll do that. I think we can probably handle those quite quickly. And then we'll move to the major topic for today's office hour, which is the demand side resources scenarios, both the commercial industrial scenario and the residential. And Cynthia, when we get to that, I think we'd like to start with you based on your questions you submitted last week when we get to that. So thought I'd give you a heads up to see if that's okay with you. Okay, sounds good. See, Kara, thank you for joining, Kara. We have um, opted to have your questions regarding the social cost of carbon come first on this agenda today in this office hour, and then we'll move to the demand side resources scenarios. So we are going to turn this over to you, Kara, to ask questions that you might have regarding the results on that analysis that was presented yesterday. And then we'll open it up to other stakeholders who have questions about the social cost of carbon analysis in this office hour. So Kara, please go ahead with your questions that were remaining from yesterday.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate this because, like I said yesterday, I'm very curious and just need to engage in more learning in this area to deepen my understanding. So I was wondering what method EPE or Ben may have used in applying the social cost of carbon modeling, meaning, was social cost of carbon applied equally to all of the proposed resources? Um, and over what duration of time was it applied?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we modeled the social cost of carbon, again, just to kind of maybe just level set here, is we modeled it as part of the capacity expansion modeling phase. So let me just bring up, actually, sorry, just real quickly, let me bring up the presentation from yesterday, and we've got a visual aid here. Margie, can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Yes, Ben, we can. Thank you.
Okay, and I won't go to full slide mode. I'll just start here. Okay, so we modeled the social cost of carbon within the capacity expansion phase. So what that meant was as we were optimizing the model, so as the model was looking at what resources it should build that resulted in the lowest cost portfolio that met both the resource and energy adequacy requirements, there was an additional cost added on for carbon emissions. So for every megawatt hour of carbon emissions from a carbon emitting resource, so from a thermal gas resource, it would incur an additional cost. And that additional cost was $130 per metric ton. So as the model was going for its optimization program, if it was building a new gas unit and the new gas unit was dispatching, so it was running, then there would have been an additional cost of $130 per metric ton there, Karen. The cost that we show, or let me just quickly just talk through just the results. So what this did was essentially we ran it at the second stage. So we did not run it for Texas. So we sold for the least cost without a social cost of carbon. We locked in the Texas portfolio. We then re-optimized to meet the New Mexico need with the social cost of carbon. Now, keep in mind, in the New Mexico portion, it could not build any new gas resources. So the only way the social cost of carbon could impact the resource build was changing the mixture of solar, storage, and wind that was being added in New Mexico. And what it actually did was it built more solar resources. So those solar resources are obviously going to create additional generation, additional megawatt hours that has zero carbon emissions. And in turn, it built less storage resources. So it said, if I'm going to build these solar resources to meet our plan and reserve margin requirements, I need fewer battery energy storage resources to meet that need. And if we look at the cost just real quickly, the way the costs are implied is after we've done that optimization, the model then runs, and for every single metric ton of carbon that is being emitted across the portfolio, it incurs that $130 per metric ton cost. So that's why you see these very large incremental cost additions down here for running this carbon cost. That's essentially saying for every metric ton of carbon, you're assigning $130 per ton, and this is the incremental cost over these periods. Did that answer your questions?
Those incremental costs are assigned to the identified resources that could be built out?
No, the incremental costs are just assigned across the entire portfolio. So they're not directly assigned to any one resource. If you wanted to take like a deeper dive and look at the cost impact to individual resources, you could essentially look at their capacity factor or their carbon emissions per year, and then just assign that metric ton cost to those resources. What it would typically result in is the less efficient resources. So if you've got like an old gas steam unit with say a 12 or 13 heat rate, those units would probably be dispatched even less frequently than they were before, and more efficient gas generation would run because that would have fewer carbon emissions and fewer costs embedded within it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Kara, I don't know if you have another question. I see Ramon's hand is up. Do you want to have do you have another question, or should we go to Ramon's?
I would go to Ramon's and then we'll just build upon questions if
Okay,
that's okay.
great. Yeah, that'd be fine. Ramon, please go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm supporting Kara sort of behind the scenes and as a part of this entire thing. We're with Sweep and CCAE work together closely, so I know some of the nature of some of the questions. I've actually prepared like a couple of questions that I might pop in the chat that will sort of like support what I'm going to be asking. But I think what is maybe causing a little bit of hang up is sort of the slide that's showing like the $5.4 billion increase in costs. And I guess I want to explore the idea that, like, of course, when you put social cost of carbon on a situation, you're expecting to increase costs because you're now internalizing costs that have previously been externalized, right? But am I understanding correctly that that $5.4 billion in increased costs is compared to the least cost plus REA scenario that doesn't have the social cost of carbon like in any way applied to it?
Exactly. Yeah. So Ramon, just to be very clear here, the way these results are presented, the majority of those costs, that $5 billion that you see, is driven by the social cost of carbon being added, right? There will always be some marginal increase in cost caused by the different expansion plans, right? Because you're no longer solving to the least cost, you've got an additional constraint. But yeah, the majority of those 5 billion costs are as a result of the $130 a metric ton.
Right. And so if I think the sense is that like what the model did, like once you basically turned on the social cost of carbon, it said that the like new resource additions that were sort of the makeup of that least cost plus REA that needed to shift in order to optimize, right? So if you applied the social cost of carbon to your like new resource additions sort of portfolio of new resources, presumably that's going to be some number greater than 5.4 billion. It's going to be like costs of maybe 6 billion, and then the model optimized in order to come down to 5.4 billion. Is that an appropriate sort of way to think about like what happened when you put social cost of carbon on the model? It needed to shift in order to optimize.
You've lost me a little bit on the shift and optimal. I think I'm following you, Ramon. I think I agree. So let me maybe just say it in different words and just see if we're aligned here. So the least cost portfolio, least cost plus REA portfolio meets the RPS standard, but has no additional constraint for social cost of carbon.
Correct.
That sets the baseline cost of essentially being $0, right? It's just a zero baseline cost.
Yep.
Then the social cost of carbon re-optimizes in the objective value. So the cost solution that it's solving to has that embedded social cost of carbon within it. So then when you compare the two, the majority of those costs are being driven by that incremental cost of carbon tax.
Yeah. And so I think what's potentially like interesting, in some ways that feels like an apples to oranges comparison, right? You're saying a scenario that doesn't have social cost of carbon in it at all is like your baseline, it's your apple, and then you apply social cost of carbon, and like that's the orange, and that's the $5.4 billion increase. I think what might be interesting to some of the stakeholders would be like, could you almost just like hold the new resource additions of that least cost plus REA portfolio, just hold them, apply the social cost of carbon to that scenario? You know how much is being emitted, and say like once we internalize those formerly externalized costs, that scenario, it's no longer optimal, and that is why this sort of new set of resources were picked by the model once it sort of went into its optimization effort. Then you truly sort of have like an apples to apples, and not just say there's this $5.4 billion increase. It's kind of saying, we solved without social cost of carbon. Once we applied social cost of carbon, there's this jump, and then we had to actually optimize, and that's why it became sort of the portfolio that it became.
Yeah,
Do you get that?
I completely agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
because just
I
like
think
as is, these slides sort of leave it hanging. You apply the social cost of carbon, suddenly the whole darn thing becomes $5.4 billion more expensive. But it's a little bit of a red herring because it's comparing, that apples to oranges scenarios. It'd be
no,
great
I
to
don't
see
disagree.
apples
So
to apples scenarios.
I think the easier way to do that, Ramon, rather than kind of as you just described, is to simply go into the 5.4 billion and subtract the imputed cost, the indirect cost, right? And then that takes you back to 0.1. I think really where I focus on here is essentially how does it change the resource build, right? And what it's essentially doing to the resource build is saying, okay, you can't avoid any new gas generation because there isn't any in New Mexico. So add more solar, add less storage. There will be, of course, an incremental cost. And then what we plan on doing at the end, when we get to the point where all the scenarios done, is comparing the carbon emissions across different scenarios, right? And you'll be able to say, okay, the social cost of carbon scenario ends up avoiding X amount of metric tons of carbon. Here's the incremental cost of it. Therefore, the cost of this solution is going to be the incremental cost divided by the incremental carbon savings.
Yeah, I think something like that could work. It's just sort of as sort of left hanging. Like you look through the slides, and I think those of us that are wanting to think about the costs of emissions, right, to say it's a $5.4 billion increase, it's fundamentally because we've internalized externalized costs, and
yes,
that makes it almost, it makes it seem like the least cost plus REI scenario is like has to be the way forward, because suddenly there's this $5.4 billion like tag on it. So figuring out how to make those sort of be in an apples to apples, either by the way I described it or the way you described it, I think would be interesting.
Yeah, no, and I think, Ramon, just to clarify why it was presented this way, is the approach was just to make them all apples to apples in how it compares the total PVR system cost to the baseline least cost plus REA. I mentioned to Cara yesterday, there's 3 or 4 different ways you can model the social cost of carbon, right? And, this is kind of like the out the can. But yeah, as we come to kind of write the report and write the IRP, I think that kind of more granular explanation is definitely required, and was my expectation to write that.
Great.
Great.
Thank you.
Good. Good discussion. Thank you for raising that, Kara and Ramon. Any other questions on this particular scenario before we move to the DER scenarios?
I did have one more question, and Ramon, you can jump in if needed. Your modeling produced two different outputs or two different results. I hope I'm stating that correctly. Are you following me, Ben?
Are you talking about in terms of like the least cost case and then the least cost plus REA case?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
And let's see. Does the model output of the model outputs, because there were at least two, affect the emissions over time, and did one of your model outputs produce greater or lesser emissions over time?
So let me just check we're talking about the same thing before I answer that question.
Okay.
So let me just again share my screen, and apologies. I don't know if I've actually got them both in here. We might go back to the 6 presentation, which I have here. Okay, can you now see a PDF of the 6 presentation?
Yes.
All right, let me just get down. I want to make sure we're just talking on the same page here. Okay, so are you referring to these two cases as we look at this, kind of like the phase 1 of the modeling effort is least cost, where we essentially ignore any state requirements and then solve, and then we kind of do a phase 2 and add the New Mexico REA requirement? Is that what you're referring to, Car?
You applied social cost of carbon to both of them, or
No, we
only to the, okay.
just this least cost plus REA case.
Yeah, I was thanks for wading through this with me. For the application of the social cost of carbon, it produced the result for natural gas plants to be used at a different frequency over time. So we had, I think, in one of the scenarios produced, use of more natural gas plants for a longer duration of time than in a different scenario. So like there were 100 solar and maybe 150 solar facilities, something like that. Ramon, can you jump in, because this is related to the email that you sent me, and which I did understand, but I'm having a hard time maybe stating.
Yeah, I think, and those numbers I gave you in the email, Kara, were just to be illustrative, but I think we're trying to confirm that in one of the scenarios, you essentially just are continuing to use the existing like gas infrastructure fleet almost like more optimally. And then in the second scenario, probably the one with social cost of carbon, you're finding opportunities to sort of use the gas fleet less because you're bringing on more solar. You haven't added new gas, but sort of the existing gas fleet is going to fire less megawatt hours onto the system. Is that sort of an accurate way of saying what's happening once the social cost of carbon is happening? Is you're bringing on more resources so you can kind of like turn down the existing fossil fleet?
It is, but let me just get back to that slide here. So this is the comparison of the expansion plan, so the resource build. If you look at the case with the social cost of carbon against the case without the social cost of carbon. So what you see here, Ramon, these yellow bars here are the additions in the social cost of carbon case. versus the reductions on the negative side of the horizontal axes. So what you see is the model says, okay, if we have this social cost of carbon, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to build more solar resources, just because solar, is obviously a generator, it produces megawatt hours. By having that additional solar on the system, you then very likely are reducing the capacity factor of your existing gas generation, right? Because it's got a higher cost. On the flip side, the other thing it also did was said, well, if I'm building this additional solar, now I'm building more resources than I need to meet my plan and reserve margin requirement. So rather than overbuild, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build less battery energy storage just to maintain hitting my plan and reserve margin requirement. So the social cost of carbon adds solar to the New Mexico portfolio and reduces storage in a same amount from a credit capacity perspective.
Kara, does that answer your question?
Yes, that does. I appreciate you revisiting this.
Great. Thank you both for your conversation. Then if we're ready to move to the demand side resources, the demand side scenarios, I think, Cynthia, I don't know whether you want to start with the commercial, industrial, or residential, but let's go ahead and move to Cynthia for starting the questions on the demand side scenarios.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I'd like to set the stage first by taking everybody to 2 slides. I'd like to first go back to our slide 12 from yesterday, if we could. Is that what you just got there for me, Ben?
Give me 1 second, Cynthia. I will be there shortly. Here we go.
Okay, thank you. And if we can scroll down on this, what I said a couple of times maybe, or at least once, this is now the base case for New Mexico, which is just the base case, but it shows the resource additions by nameplate and then also accredited capacity that are required in a non-gas portfolio for New Mexico. And so if we look just at 2030, what you see here is there's a capacity requirement, a need requirement of 245 megawatts. Okay, that's shown under need, and then also capacity. 254. I'm a little dyslexic. Now the nameplate up here, you can add those numbers together, and that's almost 900 megawatts. Okay, a lot of battery. Okay, then when you apply the ELCCs and come up with an accredited capacity, you solve at exactly what is your need. So 900 megawatts of capacity nameplate, then when it translates through accredited capacity comes up to just 254 megawatts of resource. And my thought is that if we were to have this as the New Mexico preferred plan, it would be extremely expensive. That's a lot of resource, solar and battery for 900 megawatts, essentially for 250 megawatts of load. Okay, that's my first observation. Okay, and then if we went back to the Ben or whoever, can we go back to the June 17th presentation?
Yep, I believe I'm there.
Or June 17th?
That was the 6th meeting.
Was it 16th or 17th?
Oh, hang on.
Your slide 58.
Sorry, let me get to the date on this. The June 17th meeting?
Yeah, there it is. Yeah. Then
Yep.
the slide 58.
58.
And this one, we're going to get into the results of the residential DER stakeholder scenario. And just to refresh everybody on that, that's the That's the DER proposal project that would have a build out of 25,000 new homes, and they would have combined functions of demand response, energy efficiency, battery storage. Let's see what else is involved in those, in that home project. Whatever it is, okay. And my understanding is that it's a 500 megawatt and associated megawatt hour project over time. So what you see here on this slide is first box is without the DER program. This is the resources that are required on the system, okay? And this is nameplate. And then the second box shows with the DER program, okay? And then the third box shows the difference. And so I believe it's 2035, that's the full build out. That was assumed, the 25,000 homes that provide a 500 megawatts. But what you see here in terms of capacity change, capacity reduction need as a result of this 500 megawatts is that you get almost a 2-to-1 ratio of capacity savings. Those numbers of avoided gas, 281, standalone solar, 276, and then the standalone battery, 434. That comes up to almost, isn't that what, 900 megawatts, close to 900? Yeah, 991 megawatts, okay? So am I understanding that correctly, that you're getting almost, at least in terms of this modeling, you'd get a 2-for-1 almost reduction in your capacity requirements?
Yes, but with some clarifications, if you don't mind, Cynthia, just real quickly.
And that's, that now we're jumping into it.
Yeah. I think in terms of everything you just described, you're correct. If you look at the 2035 build, which is essentially once you've got the 25,000 homes installed, so you've completed the ramp schedule. But there's a couple of other things going on here. One is this scenario also includes time of use rates. So the time of use rates, if I recall correctly, and we've actually got a model running as we speak, shifts about 200 megawatts of peak demand or load, that's coincident with peak, into the early morning hours. So we've got the impact of time of use rates, which is essentially 200 megawatts of capacity reduction here. And also in another critical component here, if we look at the DER program, I think it is more than 500 megawatts. If I'm going from memory here, and we can bring up the slide in a moment, I think it's maybe 325 megawatts of storage and 300 megawatts of solar. I may be slightly off there, but it's more like 625, 650.
Okay, good. Yeah, I wondered if that 500 was low.
Yeah, we'll pull those numbers up in a moment. I've got another slide we can look at. But the one that I really want to make as key here is, per kind of the stakeholder request, the DERs have 8-hour battery energy storage. At the moment, the model is selecting 4-hour battery energy storage. So when you see like this very large avoidance here of batteries, one, you've got to factor in, obviously, the DRs also have batteries, so that would kind of be adding to these numbers, or it would be diminishing the quantity of these numbers. And then the other thing you need to remember is, if you force in 8-hour batteries to replace 4-hour batteries, it is going to have a larger impact. Okay. So if you wanted to look at just purely like a true apples to apples comparison, one thing you would want to do would be remove the time of use rates, which is kind of what the model we're doing right now, and it may even be done towards the end of this meeting, and try and isolate how much is the time of use rates changing this portfolio versus how much is the DER solution. implementing or impacting this portfolio.
Well,
And then
you've got a little bit of that on your slide 54 because you show a shift of almost 10%.
you do. So you see here, this is like the 200 megawatts I described earlier in this kind of circle. Oh, and actually we've got the numbers here. Perfect. So if you assume what it's avoiding 200 megawatts on peak, at this point in time, batteries or 4-hour batteries are maybe down to, let's just say, a 50% ELCC. There could be an argument, subject to checking these models, that the time of use rates is actually avoiding 400 megawatts of batteries on their own. So maybe half of the need.
Right.
So I think that's why I kind of want to separate these two models out so we can kind of, see the value streams of these two very different components.
Great, great. Well, and so to come back to this, and so I appreciate some of this clarification about the megawatt build out of the project and then the battery storage. And I just to be clear, let's see, it was modeled with 8 out. Well, no, I don't want to go there right now. What I do want to say is that there appears. Oh,
Sorry, Cynthia, I completely lost you then. I don't know if
I was because I was thinking.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I can't see your face. I can only see the screen, and it just suddenly went blank.
Let's drop this screen down. Can we drop that down?
Yeah,
no.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. So there's some different ways to parse this out. Okay. When we look at the results on the CNI DR program, when we look at the results on this DER program, when we look at the breakout with the time of use, okay? My bottom line question, and I think I've thrown this out more than once, is whether or not the company and you, Ben, for E3 is sufficiently confident at this point to proceed down the path of a preferred plan for at least New Mexico that leans heavily into DERs and demand response and takes us away from slide 12, which shows that 900 megawatts of accredited capacity required for 250 megawatts of load, and recognizing that there's still a million nuances here and such. And is the company willing? Is E3 willing? Are you going in that direction? And let me just say one last thing about that. Looking at DER, demand response, as a comprehensive aggregate of resources and programs, not just singular elements, but the recognition that, gosh, if you wanted to build out 500 megawatts of DER with equivalent megawatt, with some amount of megawatt hours, you could put that in the Plexus model and re-optimize, or you could do it simply just for the New Mexico portion at a smaller amount, and that it would be a somewhat a generic resource in the same way that right now in the portfolio analysis we have generic CTs, generic combined cycles, generic solar, storage, battery, wind. So that's my bottom line question.
So, Cynthia, obviously I cannot answer on behalf of EPE, so I'm going to kind of pass that over to them in a moment. But let me just give you my response purely from my perspective, kind of E3's perspective, and absolutely no reflection on kind of the company's opinion here. So first and foremost, going back to slide 12, I agree that solution doesn't work, right? In order to meet resource needs, meet clean energy objectives, and keep rates affordable, just continuing down this path of building solar and 4-hour storage will not be economical. It's just very unlikely to be cost effective. So that comes into saying there needs to be alternative solutions. And those alternative solutions either take one of two paths or likely a combination of the two. They obviously take kind of demand solutions, they take emerging technologies or likely a combination of the two, in addition to continuously building renewable generation. You absolutely are going to continue to see solar, storage, wind being added to utility systems. From a modeling perspective, though, when we talk about generics, I would just urge caution in comparing generics against actual feasible, realistic projects. And by that, I mean, what I don't want to do is just say, hey, EPE or any utility has a X amount of megawatt need in 2030, and we're just going to artificially reduce that to a lower need, assuming that demand response is taken up, assuming that these DERs do come online. So I think those resources, those programs should have the same feasibility requirements, the same cost guarantees, the same customer protections as utility scale resources. So to me, like there's absolutely nothing to stop a utility such as EPE saying, hey, we're going to implement pilot programs, we're going to do X, Y, or Z as part of the action plan. But I wouldn't necessarily rely solely on 25,000 homes being added in the next 5 to 10 years. But that's just my perspective. I'll hand it over to EPE for the company's perspective.
And I have a quick question before anyone, any technical expert asks. I was out of town for the stakeholder meeting at which the DER model was presented. What were the costs? What were the cost assumptions of that?
So there's no cost assumptions embedded within the DERs per our discussions with the stakeholders. So they were modeled, Leslie, at zero cost in order to calculate a benefit of adding these resources. So if you assume these resources are free, how much does it save the utility? In that value, the avoided costs then become essentially the break-even point where these DERs will need to come in.
How can that be used to compare against any other resource that has a cost then?
Well, so I think that's what I'm saying. It's then you then have to go out and, like, to me, from the modeling we've done to date, is not enough just to say, yes, you should make this decision. The modeling we've done to date says this is the benefits of doing a program such as this. And then it is down for EPE to demonstrate, procure, enter into contracts with entities who can, one, meet those requirements at a lower cost.
Thank you.
So Emmanuel or anyone else from EPE want to add to Ben and Leslie's comments on this question?
Cynthia, can you please repeat specifically what you want EPE to address on there?
Cynthia, you're on mute.
And I'm back. So whether EPE has a sufficient level of confidence at this point based on the analysis that you've done to date in the realm of DER and DER to take on during the action plan period significant activities to realize DR and DER on your system, at least for the New Mexico portion, to be able to look at, say, that slide 12 and say, we don't want to go there with that amount of solar and storage on a nameplate basis for, that amount of load. We think we can look at that load and accomplish reductions in that load through demand response and service to that load through distributed energy resources. And do you have enough knowledge now in terms of what sorts of likely impacts, at least on a model basis, you could achieve to start designing pilots and test initiatives to go out and get those elements?
So that's going to be a discussion between management, ourselves, our energy efficiency department, and, you know, one or two other groups. Speaking strictly from our team's point of view, from the modeling perspective, there is enough there to start to investigate this and bring it up and start to really dig into what is actually out there for us to design something.
Okay. And when you say those discussions are going to be had, I'm hoping that those are discussions then that can affect the outcome of what is the preferred plan for New Mexico. So that, for instance, and now I'm just brainstorming, that you would be able to file as part of your IRP.
Cynthia,
Yeah.
if,
Steve.
if I may, you know, as you're talking, I'm formulating in my brain what you might say in an action plan. And Emmanuel, this is what's going through my head, is that as part of the action plan, first of all, I agree with what Cynthia's saying. And DER, things like time of use rates and such, can be implemented faster than building a whole new plant. And that's a big advantage too, given what we're looking at in your LNR, your current LNR. But that I would like to see DER addressed as a strategic initiative, not a bunch of separate little programs. And that an action item that might make sense for that is to put a time-specific date for EPE to investigate various DER things and put together a coordinated plan of steps that you might take and the order that those steps might come in and how each DE demand management activity might fit with the rest of the larger strategic program. And, you know, I think if we put that as an action item with a time specific as part of it, and potentially included some pilots. And I know sometimes the PRC and law that's in place is not real friendly to pilots, but you know, we need to break through some of those obstacles. And you know, we need to help you, fund you for those pilots if that's what it takes. Does that sound like something that would be reasonable to include in an action plan to you, Cynthia, and to you, Emmanuel?
So, I mean, first off, thank you both for the dialogue. This is exactly what we wanted to get out of these discussions. And that is exactly the type of question that we want to bring up at the stakeholder meetings so that we can all be in agreement as to what we think is going to be like reasonable and actionable. So, yeah, I think it is something that we can definitely work towards together.
So let
And
me,
I think the key thing is,
with my hand raised.
I know, I see that, Anastasia. Hold on, we'll come back.
Sorry, I just wanted to just add very briefly to Emmanuel's
Yeah, go ahead, Judy.
comments. Yeah. Also, you know, Absolutely. It's a really important dialogue, and these are the types of discussions that we're looking as we're formulating our action plan this time. But as I know, a lot of the people on the call were also involved in our 2021 IRP stakeholder process. We were having similar, discussions and exploring similar programs like with energy efficiency. So I think this is something that we, especially given the modeling results, are can have like really detailed discussions about and really discuss as part of our action plan.
Great, thank you. And let me just remind everyone that you will be getting an email from GoodWorks in the next little while, maybe next week, to ask for you to start creating the language for action plan ideas. And so this is not the place to resolve that, but please start writing those down and share it with your colleagues so that we collect that input by July 17th, and that becomes a starting point for our discussion on July 24th at the workshop. So that definitely is work to be done. I see Anastasia and Glenn have your hands up, so we're going to go to them next. So Anastasia, please state your question as briefly as possible.
So mine is addressed to all of you who've spoken to this, and especially the action plan aspect. The rule itself, the IRP rule itself, and I don't necessarily agree with the rule, but it's the rule, kind of sets things up so that you've got to come up with real objectives that can be put out in an RFP ASAP after the plan is adopted. So I see a disconnect between putting in an action plan, an idea to, let's start discussing something or do a pilot program or things like that, compared to doing what Ben is talking about and actually putting, getting real life results by putting out the one comprehensive RFP. And again, I don't necessarily agree with the rule, but that's what we've got to live with. So I guess I'd like to hear everybody's reaction to that. I mean, is this just spinning our wheels because the rule is going to push things in different ways, or is there any way to seriously make it happen?
Margie, can I respond first to Emmanuel's question that he placed to Steve and myself, and then Anastasia's point? And what I'd say.
So let me just, we're short on time, and I want to say that discussion about the actual action plan idea is not for today. Right? We will have, people can put their input as to what the action plan should be, whether it's a solicitation for demand side resources, whether it's a strategic plan. That's today's conversation, is to answer questions you have about the model results. So can we get, I think we need to get back to that. We're not going to brainstorm any further because we have limited time on that issue. But Anastasia, your point is well taken, and that should be important input for action plan idea. Cynthia, I'm going to go to Glenn before.
Did anybody have a quick reaction to, could I ask for a very quick reaction to that in terms of the modeling process and where the modeling process is leading, pardon me.
The question for Ben, will you restate that question for Ben?
Yeah, so given the points that I raised, where does that, if we're talking about alternative ways of getting closer to DER, comprehensive DER solutions, what are we giving up in terms of what's going to be included in the first IRP that comes out of pardon me, too many acronyms, the first RFP that comes out of the IRP?
So I don't think you're necessarily giving up anything, would be my response there. What the point I was trying to make to Cynthia earlier is, if you look at the IRP process, you do modeling based on generic cost, generic technical assumptions, and even for supply side resources, you do that for wind and solar. And then the second phase is you then go in, issue a competitive procurement, for example, to firm up those inputs, those assumptions, those technical kind of modeling inputs. So I don't think you necessarily have to follow the same path for demand side resources. The point I was just trying to make is they should still have the same sort of stringent requirements. It doesn't necessarily have to go through the same RFP exactly, but EPE should expect people who are being proposing DER solutions to be able to guarantee cost, to be able to guarantee technical attributes of those resources. And then once you've kind of got those firmed up alternative proposals in front of you, then you can take another look at your least cost portfolio and say, now we've seen real projects, real people who are willing to sign a contract. How does this change the overall action plan or the overall most cost-effective portfolio? That was just the point I was trying to make.
And will they be, I guess the question then is, will the DER be an option? I mean, the last, and I couldn't say whether it was the one that was right after the last IRP, but it, it asked for wind and solar and battery storage in large quantities, and then it said DER in like up 5 megawatts or larger. And so I think EPE ended up with one proposal. There needs to be, if it's going to be treated as part of this RFP process, and again, I have reservations about that, but that's our law. How do you generate responses that are of utility of utility to the utility? How do you generate useful, valid, feasible, potentially beneficial responses in the DER world? And
So
you probably know more than anybody else here because the people at EPE I know have not, have done it and have not gotten wonderful responses that make them jump up for joy and say, we've got this fixed. And I can see Emmanuel smiling, so I think he agrees. So, how do we make it happen?
So,
Or what,
yeah.
or what structures have you got in this process that could make it happen?
So the one response would have to that is, as we discussed yesterday, EPE, released an RFP yesterday for new resources. That RFP is an all-source RFP that specifically calls out that demand-side resources, or DERs, are eligible to bid into that proposal. So if there's market participants out there who have a feasible project that they can bring onto EP system, those projects are absolutely eligible to bid into a competitive procurement process. And only then, once you've really seen projects in hand, at the moment, we're assuming, going back to our earlier point with Cynthia and I's conversation, that DERs will be more cost effective than overbuilding supply side solar and storage. But once you've seen
I've looked at the IRP, started looking at the IRP, and it says
sorry, Anastasia,
we're
I'm going to
looking for
have to.
hundreds of megawatts, and that's just not going to, based on EP's history, that's not going to generate a lot of response from the DER, which tends to be smaller, isn't it? Is it?
Again, I know Margie's trying to move on, but I would just point out that there is no single resource that is going to meet that RFP need. The solution will be a combination of many, many resources, whether that's or supply side or demand side, or a combination of the two. It will almost certainly be a portfolio of resources.
And if I may quickly jump in, one sentence. I believe if the parties agree that this is a wise direction to go, the commission will be very open to a variance from the rule that allows us to pursue this direction. So
Yeah, let's see. Thanks, Steve. We're not discussing the RFP process or procurement process at this point. I want to see if there are additional questions about either of the demand side resources modeling results. So, Glenn, over to you if you have a question on that topic.
Yeah, I did want to pursue the other topic, which I guess we can do later, but I'll ask you what previous RFPs have provided information to you that allowed you to set the parameters for the model that you ran and showed us the results from.
Glenn, can you restate that question? Sorry.
Well, you're saying that the more realistic parameters for demand side management resources come from RFPs, I guess all source RFPs or other RFPs. So is there a previous RFP from EPE or other utilities you've worked with that are informing the way you're doing this modeling now?
Yeah, I would maybe just clarify my response. I don't think I necessarily said like more accurate parameters. The parameters for the DER scenario that we're modeling as part of this IRP was stakeholder driven. It was informed by the stakeholders, based in part by a DER developer, for lack of a better term. So the expectation is the parameters that were modeled as part of the IRP are relatively realistic and pretty accurate. All I'm saying, Glenn, is we need to then, any prudent utility should just confirm those operating parameters, those cost assumptions, right? Just because we model wind, just for argument's sake, at $30 a megawatt hour, making up a number, you don't then just go and procure wind, right? You then need to go and issue an RFP to confirm the modeling assumptions. So that's all I was trying to get at.
Okay, yeah. So then when you have firm bids to drive the parameters for modeling, we're not going to see that next spin of the models until what, the next IRP cycle? Is that how that would work?
Well, I think they would be in, and I don't want to speak for EPE here, but the typical kind of response would be some sort of regulatory filing after the IRP in terms of resource approvals.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. I see Don has his hand up and Don, please go ahead.
Ben mentioned the RFP that just came out yesterday, and I'm wondering, first, are we still going to, within this process, I kind of lost track of where we are, address DR specifically with large load customers? Is that still to come in one of the office hours?
So Don, yesterday, well, in the previous workshop, there was a result of the CNI that included large load customer, the demand response results in that scenario. Was there something specific that you had wanted to ask about that modeling result?
Well, I got to tell you, I don't remember the results of that.
So maybe let me encourage you to go back and listen to that part of workshop number 6, unless there's something, Ben, you wanted to summarize, maybe that slide from workshop 6 that gave the key results. Maybe that would be helpful for Don.
Today we're talking about the residential side and 25,000 homes. But to me, the big action has always been with these large loads. And in my scenario that I submitted, had lots of evidence that even reducing loads very small amount by large load customers at peak could make a huge difference in resource. And I just don't remember us talking about that in any detail.
So there's Don, on the 6 meeting, so the prior meeting from yesterday, slides 41, 41 through sorry, it's a little slow when I'm doing PDF version here. Slide 52, so 41 through 52 address the CNI demand response program. They have the same slides as we kind of looked up for the other scenarios. Is there anything specifically here you want to discuss? Do you want to look at?
Well, I guess I'm wondering how this, and this is how this will emerge in our considerations of both the system, the needs, and the action plan. I'm just trying to, it seems like an important thing. I just don't know how this is going to come back onto the playing field moving forward.
This is Cynthia. Can I address that?
Yeah.
I sent to EP and E3, and you were also copied on it, Dawn, last Friday, a email about the modeling results from this scenario. So thank you for bringing it up. And when we look at the key takeaways here, what we see is that there actually is some demonstrated benefit from the way that this was modeled. Annual benefits of the 15 to 20 million. That's not bad for a 100 megawatt resource. CNI demand response. The ELCC on this resource is pretty low, down in the 35% range. As Ben notes in the prior slides, on this program, oh, well, as he notes right here, you know, the key takeaway here is that the results are not bad, okay? It looks like this could be promising. The question is how could this be expanded to increase the benefits, right? And so there's a variety of ways that you could go at this. And what I wrote about in my memo is that probably the easiest bang for the buck for the company at this point would be to do use its AMI system, which is almost fully built out, and go with a fully automated demand response program that wasn't just limited to CNI customers. And I gave some information on that. And then short of that, you could curtail, offer design curtailment programs, interruptible programs for CNI customers different from what we have now on the system. You recognize that there's a tremendous amount of value associated with having some strategic interruptible curtailable loads, you know, starting in 2026, when you talk about Steve's point of strategic initiatives.
Yeah. I guess, and this is the first time I've been through this kind of IRP. I'm just trying to figure out, like, I'm assuming, and I don't know, on the RFP that was just issued that completely bypasses the IRP. Ben, I think this reminds me a little of what I was going to ask you about. How is participation in demand response? I think you explained this, and maybe I didn't understand it just a short time ago. How does participation in demand response activities by these large load customers in the RFP that just was put out, how is that considered? I think you said they were allowed to bid in on it. I'm just trying to understand how that can come to be from the RFP.
Yeah, so from the IRP, and just to be very clear here, the RFP is kind of like a guideline to proposals that can come in, but it is non-restrictive, right? So if it's not specifically stated in the RFP, you know, bidders can still come in if they have like unique solutions we didn't think of. But what is specifically called out in the RFP is DERs, so distributed energy resources. So essentially, you know, behind the meter solar, behind the meter storage, something like, you know, the Chris's product that, you know, we've previously discussed could bid into the RFP, and that would have a demand response component potentially. The other thing that we could look at within the constraints of an RFP is like an aggregator. So essentially companies come together, they may sign up, for example, a bunch of Walmarts, just to use Walmart as an example, and they can kind of, you know, shuttle fridges and freezers and kind of do rolling interruptible program. So those sort of bidders can come directly into the RFP. The ones that are a little bit more challenging is when you look at it on a load side, right? So if you have a data center who has naturally an almost 100% load factor, but who are willing to be interrupted, then you would have a fewer or less resource need to meet that customer's requirements. So that's kind of handled slightly differently. That just then becomes kind of more of a cost comparison of, okay, how much would it cost to serve the customer without being on an interruptible program based on the bids that come into an RFP? And potentially, if they were willing to sign up for an interruptible program, how many resources could you avoid? And that's kind of embedded within the evaluation guide of the RFP.
Well, does that, let's say I have a data center and I am willing to curtail, does that give me any advantage on the RFP versus a company that says, no, I need it the whole time, I'm not willing?
Well, it doesn't necessarily give you a direct advantage in the RFP because the RFP is solving on the supply side, or the demand and supply side in terms of resources. When you start looking at loads, then if a customer was willing to be interrupted, then EPE's resources needs would be reduced by an amount depending on the kind of the constraints of that program, which would reduce EPE's cost to serve said customer and the portfolio more broadly. So then it would be up for EPE and the customer, within their contract, their terms and conditions, to kind of work out how those potential savings are passed on to the customer. That's really more of the contract negotiation and outside of the RFP process.
The
RFP, sorry, Doug, just to add one thing there, just to clarify, the RFP law would help inform those value streams, right? It would tell you how much cost you're avoiding by having a customer on an interruptible tariff.
Yeah, and I just really quickly just wanted to state, again, Ben, as you mentioned, we did issue our RFP yesterday, but we're gonna try, like, as a company, not to go into too many details about like the specifics of the RFP. As you know, as what's in the RFP, there's a timeline on when we can get the NOIs, the notice of intents to bid, the proposals and so forth. So we're just trying to be like really mindful of the conversations that we're having to the specifics of it.
Thanks, Judy. And I'm going to call this conversation to a close because it's not related to the modeling result. It's more related to how do we implement demand response kind of solutions in both the residential and the commercial space. And so
where is that, Margie, going to be then?
So you are free to suggest action plan items related to this as we gather your input for workshop number 8. And so we'll be sending you a template to put your ideas in for action plan. And then that's where the conversation will be. Stakeholders will suggest actions. The utility will come with their suggested actions. We'll have a conversation about where they intersect. But at the end of the day, it's the utility's decision as to what action items they take on, what action plan items they take on. And we will assess the degree of agreement between stakeholders and utilities on those action plan items.
So Margie, if I might just interject, Don, really appreciate the thinking here and some of the creative avenues that you're headed down, things like interruptible rates, demand response programs for C&I, TOU rates. Those are all really good items to start to gather your thinking and put it into this template that we're going to be sending to you. We are looking for measurable, actionable, time-bound items that you all want to see. Given these takeaways, given the modeling results that we're covering today, what do you think EPE should do with them? So all of that thinking, please capture it today and we'll get that out to you shortly and look forward to seeing it.
Thank you, Kathy.
Great. Thank you all we are out of time for this office hour. Cynthia, thank you for posing your questions. Glenn, Steve, Kara, all of you for Dawn offering ideas and clarifications on the model results. We will post a recording of this session on the GridWorks website in case you or your colleagues would like to re-listen to any parts of it. Anastasia, also thank you very much for your comments and suggestions. And thanks to Ben and Rhonda and Emmanuel and Judy, Leslie for your participation. So thank you very much. If you're interested in the next office hour, very shortly in the next day or so, we will put out the topics that are going to be covered in the next office hour on July the 9th. And so look forward for that in your email, and you'll see some additional topics that we'll cover in the next office hour. Let me turn it to Ben to see if there's anything you wanted to say in conclusion.
No, nothing more from me. Just appreciate everyone's time this afternoon.
Okay, Emmanuel, and from you?
Always, thank you very much for all the suggestions and the conversation and the dialogue. This is really, really helpful.
Great. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.